You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good. I've got a lot on my mind these days. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and I think a couple of the key topics for our generation to kind of figure out, and I don't know if we'll figure it out, but it's one of the biggest undertones is around free speech and privacy. And the reason why I tied those two together is because I think that there's some kind of trade-off, right? Most people aren't black and white about the topic, like I want 100% free speech, no controls at all, because the other side of that is there's some speech that can cause, clear and present dangers. And the same thing with privacy. It's like, yes, I'm willing to give up some privacy to get some services, but I'm not willing to give up all my privacy. And it's not like I'm not willing to give up any data about myself. And so, what I wanted to pose to you is, where are you on the spectrum in terms of privacy? How much of your private data are you willing to give up to get services?
I think it depends on the value of the service. I think, Google Maps, for example, I'm okay with location on that because it's so helpful for driving when it comes to navigation, sharing location with friends or family or things like that. I don't know if it's necessarily a black and white decision because every service has its own value. They might think it's more important than it really is to me as a user. And there really isn't a lot of discussion sometimes on what you can and can't, switch on or off from a privacy standpoint. Generally, the services are like, well, it's either all or nothing or more than you'd want to give up in exchange for that service. So I would say I'm pretty average. Sure, I give up some modicum of privacy, but I try not to be too crazy about it and just, hit allow on everything that pops up on my phone, asking for things like, oh, does my calculator really need to take pictures? Probably not. So, that's something you hear more on the Android side of things, Android apps doing like excessive permissions and things like that. But I think that's kind of where I fall on it, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I kind of feel like the next question is like, what is the role of government in terms of regulations for how much privacy should be controlled by those laws and regulations? I think, in Europe, you've got GDPR, much more restrictive in terms of privacy, and they wind up, pulling big tech into court and trying to control it a lot more. In the United States, it's less controlled. And we've kind of taken like a state-by-state approach, which makes things very complex for companies to figure out, okay, how do I deal with these things? But I think one of the things to me that's most annoying when it comes to privacy is things like when you go to a website and it says, accept our privacy policy. In other words, you cannot get access to their service, their online service, unless you accept the privacy policy. And then you go and you click into it and it's like, do I really want to read this? And for some services, you really kind of don't have an option. So if you have to go online to pay your utility bill or to manage your utility bill, you pretty much just have to accept that privacy policy. I kind of
feel the option. You can show up down at City Hall with a jar full of pennies and pay it that way.
Right.
I mean, you're still making a choice though, right? If you want to go online and have like online bill pay, that is a choice you're making.
But is that
you don't have to
fair? Is that fair? Or
I
should
think that's a totally
be
separate discussion.
Something? Well, no. I think that's the root of the discussion. I think, what do we want? This is our society collectively, right? What do we want from these services, right? I mean, just because Con Ed might be my electric company, they didn't invent electricity, and they don't. And I have to have electricity. That's a certain scenario, and I pick up the utility scenario because you really don't have much choice if you want to have electric in your home, but to use their services. And yes, you could go down there with rolls of pennies to pay for the service, but that's not realistic. So in other words, you're kind of forced by, if you want to have a normal life, to accept the privacy policy, and then they can take your data. Now, when you're talking about services like Facebook or something like that, I think now you've entered a different territory, because that's truly an optional service in most cases. There are some cases where maybe it's not. But, this is Jim McDonald's own idea, right? And I'm going to throw it out there that I think there should be classification standards for privacy policies. And a company should pick one of those privacy policies. So rather than saying you need to read our privacy policy, and they could stick one sentence somewhere in the privacy policy that you don't like, that they have to comply to one of whatever it is, 4 or 5 standard privacy policies. And then most people can kind of understand, okay, what are those 4 or 5 privacy policies? And the company can say, we're following number 4.
I mean, I think a standardized privacy policy would be helpful, but I don't think it's conducive to the way that the US is run. You'd have 50% of the population be like, yes, 50% of the population say no, and nothing would happen. So I do think maybe it is somewhat crazy, but not because it's like a crazy idea, just because that's the state of government in the US at this point. That's the way I'm looking at it.
Yeah, well, that is pretty much the state of everything right now, right? So,
yeah. But imagine if you had like a standardized template, right? A sort of like a bill of rights for a consumer to be able to easily understand what it is that they're getting in exchange for what it is they're giving away for that, right? Instead of you having like these stupid end user license agreements that pop up that are written in, legalese and lawyer speak and hide all kinds of weird terms and conditions on the inside that, oh, you can opt out, but it's on page 74, this tiny little checkbox, right? Or you have to like write in a letter to like opt out of something. Like I'd be totally in favor of like simplifying that quite a bit, but the US is a very litigious society.
Remember, like, all the years you've been in IT and how many EULAs, end user license agreements, you've clicked accept and didn't read. You've agreed to those contracts. And I think with privacy policies, the same thing happens all the time. We just don't have time to read everyone.
Well, we've been talking about like MFA, right? MFA spam and this fatigue that comes with, always having to like approve these messages on my phone, a push notifications. Like, I know it's not me. I know it's not me trying to get in, but invariably some percentage of the population just hits allow because they get tired of it. That is exactly what we do with EULAs like 20 years ago, right? At some point we got tired of it and we just clicked accept and we went it right on through. So now we're doing the same thing with, I don't know what they call it, MFA fatigue or push notification fatigue or whatever it is, but we've talked about it a few times on the show. Why don't we pivot? Well, I want to get to our main topic, which is voice biometrics. A couple of housekeeping things before we do get started, though. This is the second last show of the year for us. So we're going to take a few weeks off for winter break. 2,700 minutes of podcasts went out this year. So I think we've earned a little bit of time off to kind of regroup. We are working on some pretty cool stuff for 2023. So we'll hit episode 200 pretty early on. I think probably like February, maybe March at the latest, I would imagine at this point. We got some conference things that we're working on. So definitely, people stay tuned with that. Hit that subscribe or follow button. That totally helps us out. It's a free way to basically support the show. So that is highly encouraged.
I've got to tell you a quick story. So I was in the airport the other night and I was talking with Wayne, and somebody was like eavesdropping on our conversation. So I mentioned to Wayne about the podcast. And so this guy turns around and starts asking me about the podcast. And I spent like 15 minutes explaining the podcast. And he was like, oh, he wanted to find it on his podcast app and everything. He's like, I'm going to listen. I'm like, all right, great. Leave us a 5-star rating. He's like, well, I'll have to listen to the podcast first.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, oh, yeah. Well, you just took up like 15 minutes of my time, dude. I think you owe me something.
Yeah, leave a rating. 5 stars is always preferred. If you hate it, you say, I really hated it a lot. It was 5 stars worth of hate. That's fine too, right? I mean, either way is good. But yeah, follow, subscribe, stuff like that. It's kind of interesting. We went through stats last time, but like less than half of people who routinely turn in are actually subscribed. They just tune in and hear our drivel every week. So why don't we get to voice biometrics? Because I think that's kind of where we want to take today's conversation. Especially some of the areas around privacy concerns that kind of Jim brought up, but voice is a big part of that as well. But I think just the technology in general is pretty cool. I actually rolled it out 15 years ago, let's call it. It's kind of my first foray into that area. And I'm really happy and excited that we're able to have our guest on with us. She is Mel Dingman. She's a program director with Booz Allen Hamilton and a voice biometric and an identity zealot. So welcome to the show, Mel.
Thanks for having me. Hello.
Yeah, so thanks for taking the time. It's a Friday afternoon, and this is going to go live Monday, so it's going to be kind of a quick turnaround for us. And I think one of the things that we always like to find out the first time we have someone on the show is sort of their career journey, especially when it comes to sort of the identity work and maybe even specifically the voice biometric stuff, which you've really kind of specialized in, it sounds like. How did you get to where you are? Is this identity and biometrics area something that you chose, or did it choose you?
A little bit of both. I was in the identity space. I'm a lot older, I think, than you guys, but I started my career about 33 years ago, and almost immediately jumped in after my webcasting phase. Don't judge; it was a good one back then. But then I kind of got my foray into IDAM, Identity Access Management, and I loved it. But the more I got into it, the more I was able to see through less than always legal means that usernames and passwords and including MFA, they just aren't cutting it. They're so easy to break. And I don't mean that for everybody, but the hacker community and the black hats around identity, it's super easy to break pretty much anything that's out there today until you talk about biometrics. And obviously iPhone or Apple came out pretty staunchly with facial rec. I'm sure every one of us has done the facial dance where you're trying to get the face and then you have to do the iris dance, and it just wasn't feasible in mass use. And so VB, voice biometrics, became hot for me as I saw that there was a lot more that could be done with voice than just identification. So obviously that's the impetus behind the explosion of VB. But where the science community has evolved, it got super sexy. So I rode that. I'm all about the super sexy. So here we are.
Absolutely. And, I know we're going to get super deep, but maybe we can start, at the basics of kind of, for those who aren't familiar with how voice biometrics works, how does it work? But then take us all the way to that privacy topic that I was bringing up. Like, is my Amazon Alexa spying on me? But let's not go there yet. Let's start with how does voice bio generally work?
So, spoiler alert, yes, it is. Secondly, VB it's a very slick process. There's lots of variations in how you can deploy VB. There are lots of various models. There's a lot of different approaches. There's just all kinds of options depending on a multitude of factors, as you would imagine with any technology. You got to understand the business requirements that are supporting, or the operational or the mission goals that VB needs to support. And then based on that, there are actually options now. Although you wouldn't think so, given a lot of the banks and such are still retaining audio and they're still leveraging capabilities that are almost as old as I am. And so things have evolved. If anyone in the FinServ community is paying attention, things have evolved. Take a second look at where VB and biometrics are today for identity management and fraud prevention.
Okay, so you said the Alexa is spying on me. What does that mean? Are they just trying to gather, okay, this person needs to go and buy some new, some new cups and coffee mugs, or are they actually like looking for things and reporting them to the police?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are obviously capabilities in the intelligence community in the federal government levels that are looking for words, um, keywords, your phraseology and the mix of context in which it's um, uttered, but that's not really the job of Alexa. As you guys were talking about earlier, the whole privacy bit, and there's a lot of trust right now on the containers or the holders of your PII, your personally identified information, and you got to trust, right? Even devoid of having some sort of bill of rights for consumers and what have you, you literally could end up as the South Park episode where they're a human centipede, or you are truly being protected by the audio and the use of it that's being captured.
Mel, I kind of wonder, like, I think one of the voice applications I use the most is Siri, right? The Apple version of voice recognition, and I can't believe how bad it is sometimes. So,
It is.
what is
It's
that an
pretty bad.
indication of? I mean, is it an indication of like it could be improved, or is it an indication of just like some of the basics of different people talking differently?
So it's their universal baseline model, which is one of it's like the transmission of voice biometrics, right? And so the more it understands and how they are, if they are, which I'm sure they are, but I don't have specifics. But as long as they're applying AI and ML outside of what a white paper refers to it as, if they're genuinely applying learning capabilities to their baseline construct, then that will get better and better over time. But it's further than where they are right now because yeah, it's pretty bad. And you shouldn't have to repeat yourself. There are capabilities that are being used in the Department of Defense today, and in the Department of Homeland Security, where lives depend on the efficacy of that voice capture and the translation of it. So the technology is there. It just has to be committed to by the provider of the service. And I don't want to, I'm not slamming them because it is a costly endeavor, but the fact that it already exists makes it less costly. You don't have to go create it. And it's a buy versus build thing. And, they have lots of TNCs, things to consider, but yes, you are being spied on, but so I never really did address why, right? So it's not just to learn and evolve their capability. If they're smart, which I know at least one of the large voice bank holders is, they are turning you into a predictive marketing machine, right? So that's how they make their money is through advertisers. Services and licensing is never where the money's at. It's always in the services associated with it. So they make bank, cold hard money from the ability to predict what Jeff Stedman is going to buy after he purchases that tent. Is he going to be looking for a camper? Is he going to be looking for a place in Arizona? Right? It's an amalgamation of what you're buying and how are you searching and what are you ultimately doing with it? Are you a giver? Meaning charities. What do we serve you to make our platform the most valuable to our advertisers as we possibly can. So do they want to know that, you yelled at your wife? And no, they don't care. That although that audio is absolutely there. You can go hear it on all platforms. You can go and hear all of the audio that's been captured and delete it, but that doesn't mean that it's being triple deleted on their end. So once it's out there, it's out there, but you can hear what's being saved from your utterances.
I feel like this is where the Ron Swanson gift of him learning what a computer does and then him just walking out to the dumpster and just throwing his computer in the dumpster is where that might be.
That's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think people, if the product is free, you're the product. Is typically
Absolutely.
kind of the way to look at it is, advertising. I'm sure I'm lumped in with other folks, and it's just another key metric around well, Jeff just bought a guitar and he's trying to learn how to play. And, if you're on video with me, you can see there's one in the background. I suck. So, but at some point, I'm probably going to be looking for lessons or maybe a guitar stand or guitar picks, right? And I'm in a certain age range. All of these are data points that come together to kind of formulate what does this entity look like? And the voice biometrics that I'm providing whenever I talk to Siri, Google, I'm sure I just activated a bunch of stuff out there, right? Alexa, whatever it may be, all feeds into that. What I find a little bit interesting is at this point, we've got Siri, at least on the consumer side, we've got Siri and we've got Google. It sounds like Alexa is having some issues because Amazon I've reading articles about how Alexa is not doing great and they may shut that down or pare it back considerably. Microsoft got out of the Cortana game a while back. So are there winners and losers already in this space when it comes to the voice side?
Not really. I think it's more the value prop, right? So they're not seeing a whole lot of ROI on the investments they've made in their voice capabilities, primarily because, in my never humble opinion, they missed the boat on why to do it to begin with, or if you're doing it, while you're doing it for its initial intended purpose, expand your purview beyond what you operationally decided to invoke or that led you to invoke the use of voice or the creation of that capability. And they missed the boat. So I don't necessarily would say that there's a player. It's the how, right? So it's like, I would liken it to, you could find a bazillion really good C# developers, but if they don't know architecture, you're not going to want them to build to be it's very, that's a really crappy analogy. I'm trying to think of a better one, but my point is that it's about who and the experiences of the deployer. And there are lots of algorithms out there and they have multiple purposes and they serve better in different options, to the point that there's now multi-algorithmic fusion where there's these 8 algorithms that nail it for most of your universal baseline population. And then you put them together and then you lessen and lessen your false, your duration it takes to authenticate, your duration to time is money, especially in the call centers. Right? It's like what? I think the industry standard is $1 something a minute. That's insane. Your ROI is sucked up the minute you get a dumb customer, right? Or you get a Karen.
Good thing there's none of those out there.
No, of course not. But when you get those, their profitability and the cost to do business is trashed, right? So they have to look at all the different scenarios where they could salvage or expedite or minimize that unpredictable expense associated.
So let me pivot slightly because I want to talk about deep fakes and how does that impact things like voice biometrics. I mean, we've seen a lot of news headlines around it. I think the whole Jordan Peele Obama thing, was popular. I don't know. It seems like 10 years ago, but it was probably more like 2. How impactful are deep audio fakes to the efficacy of trying to do, strong identification or authentication through a voice biometric?
So right now, that there's a lot of dependencies there. That's a loaded question, but to date, it is absolutely avoidable. As the technologies evolve for deepfakes, especially around audio, it's going to be tough. So the industry needs to be scientifically progressive in figuring out how to stay in the proper place for the betterment of black hats and convert them. That's all I can start converting them now so that, as this evolves, we're there. Because I would say we're probably at most 3 to 5 year threshold to somebody being able to have an epic deep fake maker that we're not going to be able to contend with. So that's kind of why the Department of Defense and DHS are evolving beyond a single biometric. So while VB is absolutely, there's so many things you can do with it. When you fuse it with other biometric modalities, your false positives are almost completely eliminated. I mean, it's measurably significant when you talk about multimodal. But it's complicated, and if they're not progressive enough in their dedication to biometrics, it's a tough pitch to make. But once you dig in and you look at the ROI compared to a single modality, it gets much, much more palatable of a conversation to have.
You've mentioned this concept of fusion a couple times. Can you explain what that is to my simple brain?
No, you're fine. So it's really each independent biometric modality being fused together from a score point of view. So I've taken a score, say, from your voice. I'm taking a score from your facial. I'm taking a score from your from an olfactory biometric, and I'm fusing those together to say either you're a bad guy, or I'm fusing them together to say this guy can walk through this door without having to present a card, which can be stolen, without having to do the iris dance, or obfuscated with contact lenses, or violate, successfully penetrate the security measure. It makes that nearly impossible, because you may be amazing at faking one, but you're never going to be amazing at faking three. So it allows you to set the thresholds for entry significantly higher, thereby obviously accompanying or creating a lot more structure and security.
You said olfactory biometric.
Mm-hmm.
So as in the sense of smell?
Yes, it is the sense of smell.
Okay, this is news to me. I guess I'm not up on my biometrics game, but I didn't realize that was something that was out there.
It is.
I'm intrigued.
Very much so is it out
how
there.
Stinky a person is.
No. So
or what is it? Something else?
You emit. So it's used for a lot of purposes, but the entree of olfactory came from bombs and drugs. So you have residual that you can't wash off, right? And so having a dog isn't always possible who's trained to identify, and it's difficult for them to segment between, like, I don't know if you followed Casey Anthony, that trial where they said the smell of maggots produced the same smell as a decaying carcass to a dog. So that doesn't happen in olfactory biometrics, and that's what drove the introduction of olfactory biometrics. But it's super cool because then when you get nervous, you actually emit a smell. It's a heat sink. There's a heat sink pattern as well that we can look at. So when we put all that together, we know if you're a nervous wreck, which means you probably did something wrong, or if you're fixing to come shoot somebody because you've got a bomb hidden in a backpack. So olfactory has become pretty sweet with identifying bad guys. There's probably not a whole lot in industry where that's applicable, other than like the airports, train stations, transportation modalities. But yeah, it's super cool, right?
How important is the quality of the audio? With the Identity at the Center podcast, strive for excellent audio.
Yeah,
but,
I know.
When you're
here for the pregame.
Yeah, pregame was it's always many hurdles to overcome. But how important is it that the quality of the input or the recording is at a high level to avoid false positives, or is that just a factor?
It's a factor. You're gonna have to contend with it, right? But it has evolved so far in doing sound separation. And if you have any familiarity with natural language processing, and how far that has come, it's giving us a very targeted method of separating sound from voice. But in the cases of identifying fraud or bad actors, in certain scenarios, obviously in the DoD, it's important to hear what's around as much as it is to hear what they're saying, how they're saying it. So quality. So the give factor there is I need more audio if it's really bad quality, as opposed to if you're sitting in this scenario where our audio is on fleek, that's moot, right? I can capture you in literally a second and a half of audio. But yeah, so that's where that is now.
But if you're recording and it's like 3 seconds in a subway station, it's probably maybe not enough.
Not for one time. If you are in and out of different places, like when you call your bank, and want to use the audio authentication or the voice authentication, if you've had a cold before, and have called into the bank, if you have called from a subway, if you've called from the airport, standing underneath, a loud jet engine, it learns, right? That's the machine learning element and beauty that lays in modern voice biometrics. So yeah, there's a lot of factors there, man.
I could see you as an expert witness in a trial where you had like 3 seconds of audio recorded in a subway station, and then you start running through the scientific, like, all right, we're 78% sure based on this, and 48% sure based on this, and therefore we have a 99% sureness
Mhm.
that this is the same person.
Absolutely.
So, okay. Well, I think we beat that one pretty good. But I wanted to bring up kind of in the IAM space where I've run into voice biometrics a few times is like, I wonder if this would be a good application. I'd like to get your opinion. So it's what we call, quote unquote, the clean room scenario. So it's the idea that we want to do MFA, but the person who's in the clean room, whether it's, the typical like situation where somebody's wearing like a bunny suit, or, potentially it's like in a prison. But anyway, the person can't bring in their phone, so you can't send them a second factor. The question is that a good scenario to use voice? Because my understanding is that like with a lot of biometrics, you have device specificity, right? So you have to go through the registration on each device. But with voice, the voice is being stored in kind of a central location, or the voice fingerprint, which is probably just a number, a long string of numbers. Am I thinking about this right?
You're absolutely right. And if you're talking about, like, especially if you look at jail or prisons, it's a hell of a use case, right? Because voice is absolutely there. Everybody talks, but what are you going to do when you get a deaf person? So, I mean, not that that happens all the time, but there is something to be said about that being a perfect case for fusion. Because not only will you identify, you'll be able to tell if they have bad intentions. So if somebody's coming in and they're hiding something, even the best people readers, there's always someone who's going to be better, more charming, or more effective at getting something in that's bad. It's super cool use case for um, biometric fusion.
So I think that that kind of central storage of the fingerprint of the voice is kind of one of the advantages or differentiators between VB and other forms of biometrics. But I think the other thing is, in a lot of those scenarios, if somebody's wearing a bunny suit, right, they're not going to be able to do a fingerprint. They're not going to be able to necessarily do facial recognition, things like that. So it might be one of the few scenarios where voice might be one of the few options. I guess what I'd like to also ask is, are there other use cases that you see voice used in a lot for authentication where it makes sense?
Other than FinServe,
Well, so tell me what you mean by that.
financial services.
Oh no, I'm sorry, I knew that part. But what do you mean in terms of using voice for FinServe? Is that just like when you call the call center?
Sometimes, but like Bank of America, for example, is doing, I don't know if they have rolled it out nationally or globally yet, but they've created banking centers that don't have people. So you can literally walk up to a screen that is about below your waist to probably, depending on your height, of course. For me, it's like a foot over my head. So I would say it's probably a 4 or 5 foot tall screen with AI. It has an artificial agent on the other side, and I don't have to authenticate. I exist. So I know there's some in the near the subway stations on Broadway in New York City. There's a couple in Columbus. We're such a test market. It's silly. We get the first flavor of Lay's when they first release it to see how we do.
Which can be good or
Anyway.
bad, depending on the
Right,
flavor.
exactly. Cinnamon Toast Crunch flavored Doritos. No, thank you. Anyway, so the use case there is wicked cool because you literally don't have to do anything but walk in and conduct your business. It's a sweet use case if you think about applying that theory to something like Walmart. Think of how Walmart could use that from a predictive marketing point of view. So they follow a pattern of life, right, or a pattern of your existence throughout a store. They have security cameras anyway, so use that data, right? So watch where they're going and what are they buying and in what order. And so what would they likely buy, impulse buy at the register? Or you noticed when these products are close to these products and this one gets purchased because it's right behind them. It increased sales of these items. So we got to stop thinking that it's just about authentication. It's about making I'm a capitalist, can you tell? It's making money and it's making money more effectively, which would drive costs down. I think the economic ramifications are pretty big if we get out of our own way and stop worrying about the false connotation of biometrics being an invasion of privacy. Because it's not. We're not holding your voice. We're retaining your audio. We're triple hashing, creating a big long number that if you stole it, even if I sent it to you, you would not be able to identify even that it's yours. Right. So there is no PII involved in VB. It isn't. So once we get out of that and stop worrying about that, then we could talk about what can really be done with biometrics. Soapbox off.
So what about scenarios where you definitely do not want to use, like the opposite, right? We talked about a couple of use cases here where, yeah, it makes sense, a prison or a jail or financial services or retail in general. I think being able to walk up and say, hey, I want a quarter pounder with cheese, only onions and fries and a Coke, right? Rather than talking to a person, which appears to be going by the wayside, or going up to those one stupid little iPads and keying in your own order, right?
They might actually get the order right, so I'm good.
Right, yeah, and I'm okay with that part too. But what's the opposite of this? Like, where is voice biometrics never to be used?
I don't think it exists.
There's no scenario where it just doesn't make sense to apply voice biometrics as part of the authentication string or the identification.
Not for me.
Even in like a loud place, quiet place maybe with a lot of voices, like an airport or a subway station.
Nope.
Noise isolation, false, anything like that.
We already do it, right? There's an effort that was done by the Air Force, and the Department of Defense's S&T program, which is their science and technology. It's kind of like the evaluation space for the Department of Defense, where they literally can authenticate a pilot standing at his aircraft while it's running. They can do all kinds of funky, cool Medina stuff now that I can't think of a single scenario where it would not be a relevant possibility.
Okay. How about it might be capable, but what point does the cost outweigh the benefit? Are these scenarios where it's super expensive to have, okay, well, do we really need to be able to identify a pilot outside of his F-16 while the engines are running?
Yes, you do.
I can't imagine that's cheap to do.
It's not cheap. That would not be on the heavier side of cost. It's really
what drives cost in voice biometrics?
Speed to authenticate, the thresholds you're willing to accept, and then that's about it. That's probably it. Speed and accuracy.
Are those metrics that a buyer of software can really gauge or get that information from a software vendor? So if I'm in the market for a VB solution, are those the things that I should be looking at? And are they metrics that the vendor will provide and I can rely on their answers?
Okay, you had me until you threw in the and telling the truth part. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of variation there too. It's kind of like I feel like I'm not giving you any straight answers, but it's true. I mean, when you look at if you're in the market for a VB solution, you need to solidly understand why and what are your requirements. Meaning, like, do I have an alternative flow that's less expensive if I give up a bit of percentage, or if I require a slightly longer elongation of audio acquisition. You got to look at all that before you have the conversations of percentages. But like in a financial entity, you're not going to want anything less than 99.9%. I even would prefer 100, but 100 isn't going to happen. But if I can acquire a positive ID, 100 at 100% confidence in 3 seconds, I'm in. But if it's 30 seconds, which I know some banks are still on that old antiquated technology where I got to run my mouth and tell you 5 times how much I love to use my voice as my password. No thanks. It's not going to happen. I'm just going to hit zero, like viciously.
Right. No, that's clearly annoying. But I guess I want a clarification on that. So is it 30 seconds if I know, okay, it's claiming to be Mel dialing in. So I just have to check this voice against what I know from Mel. Or is it, you are one of my 200 million customers, and now I have to use your voice to figure out which of those 200 million customers are you?
Therein lies the rub, Jim. That is absolutely the differentiator algorithmically is inclusionary logic versus exclusionary logic in the voice biometrics algorithmic approach. Um, it, it, it it sounds like it wouldn't make any difference, but when you look at it scientifically, the data's there that if I already know you exist, like if there was a global voice biometric database of everyone to authenticate anything, then it's going to be 100% inclusionary logic, meaning I don't even look to see if you're excluded from the data set. Now, exclusionary logic is where they look at it and say, so can I exclude her from being any other entity than Mel Dingman? And so that algorithmically and how you forge the process is where that becomes a differentiator.
So what's next for voice biometrics? Like, what's the cool thing coming up that we need to be aware of?
So it's here, but sentiment and intention are wicked cool. And now it's here, but it's not widely used yet. I think it's worth looking at if you're in industry. There are so many use cases where sentiment and phraseology is really underestimated right now. There's a lot of value there, even if it's good versus bad, or if it's they're really irritated, or they say they're irritated and they're really not, or they make a false claim. It's not like a lie detector, but if you're multimodal fusing, you could absolutely have a lie detector capability in multimodal fused biometrics. So it depends on your industry, of course, but sentiment and phraseology is wicked cool. And that is the factor allowing that deception versus well intended in the result of the biometric.
I've kind of seen that sentiment in some recent sci-fi films and TV shows I've been watching, where it's like, you have the scanner, it's like, oh, the person's lying just by the way they're talking. How do you establish sentiment? Like, how does a normal person do this? Or is it just the massive amount of data that's out there and correlating it across the other modes?
So that is not my area of expertise.
Okay.
There's a couple wicked cool scientists who are doing nothing but that. And the only company I know right now who's really nailing it is Nexidia, which was bought by Nice Systems. They're the only company I've seen that has truly made some strides there in how to use sentiment outside of the government space. It's used all over in government, but for different purposes. But in industry, talk to the scientists over at Nexidia.
Okay. I think it's probably a show topic for maybe 2023, given where we're at right now in the year.
Yeah,
Trying to
I'm definitely
figure that one
listening to
out.
that one.
What about AI when it comes to voice biometrics? And the use case that I'm thinking here is Data from Star Trek, a walking, talking android that is a simulacrum of a human being. Do you think at some point that they would have their own voice biometric, or would it be maybe something else behind the scenes, like microservice API calls based on, I don't know, Bluetooth or Wi-Fi signals that the robot is generating, or things like that?
I would say the capabilities exist today. I know that there's a couple AIs that are fully functional and can do voice activated things. But I guess the question is, should they, and how far do you want to take that? But how that happens, it's going to evolve. But at this point, I would say it can be on board. Absolutely, you can have on board until
About
robots
music?
take over the world and we have to call Will Smith. So there's I don't know remember the name of it. It's all over the place right now. Where mostly actually in the Asia Pac region, where they're generating whole songs, whole artists, 100% with AI. But I'm too old to remember the name.
And this is full on original, I guess, scores or songs, or interesting.
Self-creating. Yep. I've seen them do. I've heard, my daughter's really into this. And I've heard EDM. I've heard an opera singer who wasn't really an opera singer, it was an AI. I've heard, what's that? You said it earlier, Jim. What's the name of that genre of music where they...
Country?
Stop. No, I didn't hear country. I forget. But it's like an evolved Gen Z genre of music. But I forget. But yeah, so it's super cool. It's there, and it's only going to get better.
Is the fidelity of that audio there, or is it still mechanical sounding?
Oh no, not even a little bit.
Interesting.
So I think go ahead, Jim.
Well, I think when you can take data points and big data and crunch it all together. I mean, they already know like beats per minute, what people like, and what how to construct songs so that people are attracted to them. Now take that and start taking what kind of voices people are tend to like, and you mix all that together and hit the themes that people like, and now all of a sudden you just have an algorithmically made to be popular song,
or even just customized, right, to a person's flavor profile.
Yeah.
Mel and I like our EDM. Jim likes his country, right? We're going to have different opinions over everything at different point, but our own unique listening sound pattern, right? We can essentially generate audio on the fly that matches with our mood or whatever our preferences are. I think that is fascinating.
It is fascinating.
That's like Spotify Unwrapped on steroids, basically.
Yep.
All right. We've been talking an awful lot here. I want to close out on a lighter note. We've got a couple options, and the one that I'm going to pick here is you have your own late night talk show. Who do you invite as your first guest? Mel Dingman. It's the Mel Dingman Show, airing, I don't know, every night on NBC. Who is your first guest on your new show?
Do they have to be alive?
No, I didn't specify, so you can pick anybody you want.
Really, Jeff? That's hard. I would have like 120 people off the bat that I would say I'd want.
Yeah, but you got to pick one, or maybe pick a lineup. 2 or 3 guests.
All right. I would want Harriet Tubman, because she was a badass. I would want George Washington. And then modern day, I would want the creators of South Park.
Matt and Matt Parker
Trey.
And Trace? Yeah.
Trey,
okay.
Yeah. That's
Jim,
my
how about
first night.
Well,
That's a strong opening night,
right?
I didn't think of historical figures. My mind went right to Elon Musk.
Oh, I have such a girl crush on him. Oh, he's still my heart.
Yeah, that's my choice. What about you, Jeff?
I'm torn, so I'm going to pick 2 and cheat. But that's why I gave Mel cover to pick whoever she wanted. I'm going with George Carlin as the opening guest, and then Jon Stewart is sort of on the bench there as well.
Really?
that's who I would start with. One, I'm a fan of comedy, and I think it would be just a fascinating conversation given how popular Carlin has been for decades, especially even, I mean, he passed away, a few years back, but he's still such an influence for a lot of comics. And a lot of the genres of comedy that are out there now feed off of sort of that, not necessarily political, but societal kind of observations and things like that. And I think Jon Stewart took it to more of the political level of it, which I thought was, just hilarious. And I could watch The Daily Show from years and years on end. And Trevor Noah, was his last show was last night, so we were watching that one last night. But I would go with George Carlin and Jon Stewart as the two that I would have on there, and then somebody historical. I think it would be cool to have like Abraham Lincoln. What movie were you going to go see? Things like that.
What movie?
Yeah,
I don't think they had movies back then.
I've got to share my George Carlin story.
Sure.
So, one of my coworkers, 15 years ago or something, this guy was hilarious. His name was Patrick Gibbons. And his father was a drill sergeant in the Marines. So you'd think like his dad must have been some kind of like, jerk, like really like overbearing. And I just couldn't imagine it because this guy was just so funny. Well, it turns out his father, the drill sergeant in the Marines, when he was a kid, was best friends with George Carlin.
Nuh-uh.
Yes, best friends. They grew up together. And
that's
so like every time I see George Carlin
here.
Yeah, no, I 6 degrees exactly.
I don't have.
So that makes me 3 degrees now, right?
Yeah, because of Jim, right? We're both connected. Yeah. We've not hit the same link.
My idol.
All right.
One of my idols.
So I think we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. Mel, you've been really generous with the time. I want to ask for 2 more minutes. What is something that people should take away from this conversation about voice biometrics? If anything, wrapping up 22, going into 2023, what do I need to know?
Biometrics is not a privacy concern. It's not PII. And number 2, use it. There's a use case for it everywhere. The end.
Okay, I didn't even need 2 minutes. Jim, how about yourself? Final thoughts for this week?
Yeah, my final thoughts are I reached out to Mel on I saw her connected to Becky Archambault at Gartner. I didn't know Mel from, anybody else. I reached out, super awesome person. I think you reach out to her and make a connection. But also, I would encourage you to take a chance, and anybody who's out there who you think you'd like to, make a connection with, not to try and sell them something, please, but just to, spark that conversation or be connected and follow them or whatever, go for it. Well, the worst they can do is blow you off.
Or block you, disconnect.
But
other than that,
don't get hurt over it. Yeah, there you go.
No, I think it's okay to ask for help, right? The problems that a lot of us face, especially in the identity space, have probably been solved before, right? And the stronger your network is, the more people you know, and the more people that you know and that they know can help you get to that answer quicker, right? We don't need to solve everything for the first time. So yeah, ask for help. I think ask for advice, right? See how other people are doing it. That's why I'm a big fan of organizations like ID Pro, for example, and the Slack channel they have, right? And this podcast we bring all kinds of viewpoints, to the conscious level, hopefully, if you're not already subconscious after listening. So that's, I think, be aware of that. And I think, Mel, if you're cool with it, we typically will put our guests' LinkedIn connection into our show notes. And if they have questions, they can reach out and, maybe tell you that you're wrong, or maybe that you're right, or maybe somewhere in between, right?
I've been wrong.
It's rare, but it happens.
But if you tell Mel she's wrong, expect a response.
And
Right.
probably a scientific, way overanalyzed one.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and leave it for this week. Want to thank everyone for listening. And you can find us on the web, identityattthecenter.com. We're on Twitter so far still at IDAC Podcast. And with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Mel, thanks you so much for taking the time. Jim, as always, thanks for the time. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityattthecenter.com.